Hey guys, it is time for Esther Chapter 2. Let's get to it. So, I am going to go ahead and start putting in the resources in the chat. So, for this book of Esther, I'll be reading out of the NIV Cultural Background Study Bible. We'll do the chapter summary, which is from Bible Hub. I will include the links for the NIV version and the amplified version of Esther 2 in the chat. Also, I was able to dig more into the name of Esther, thanks to Brother Gino, who sent me some information last night. So I went ahead and did further searching. So we're going to go through that as well. And so I'll put the links of the resources that I'll be reading off of in the chat so you can look at it yourselves. And then also the cross references I'll put in the chat for the verses for chapter 2. And I want to take a closer look at verse 6 in chapter 2 of Esther with the cross references. So we'll see what we can get through today. So let me go ahead and put the resources in the chat. So 1 second. It'll take me a little bit. Also, I do have the link for, let me pull that up right now, for Esther chapter 1 on my personal page on YouTube. So let me pull that link for you. I put it in a playlist so it's easier to find. I'm going to pause. Let's see. Share. Actually, let me go back. Forward. Sorry, back and forward. Okay, so you'll see the playlists. So let me go ahead and put that in here. Oh, come on. Work for me. Copy. Paste. There we go. All right. So let me go ahead and put the chapter summary in, which breaks down the scripture sections, the verse sections. Also, the link for the NIV. The link for the amplified version. The resources I am going to read about the name Esther. So I have 4 different resources for the name Esther, and they really, honestly, they just vary in their explanation of the name. And so I found it quite interesting. So I want to share it with you all. And then I'll leave it like that for right now. All right. So let's go ahead and read the chapter 2 summary of Esther. So, seeking Vashti's successor, a new queen arises, Esther's divine appointment. Esther 2 is a powerful demonstration of God's providence. Esther, an orphaned Jewish girl, rises to become the queen of Persia, illustrating how God can work in mysterious ways to position us right where we need to be. Her story encourages us to trust in divine timing, cultivate our character, and stay prepared for our calling, even when it seems unlikely. In verses 1 through 4, it's the king's decree. After the wrath of King Xerxes had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done. At his servant's suggestion, he decreed that beautiful virgins from every province be brought to him, prepared for royal service, and the most pleasing one would become the queen. Esther verses 5 to 7. In Susa, Mordecai, a Jewish man, was raising his cousin, Esther. Esther was lovely in form and features, but an orphan. Thus, Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter. In verses 8 to 11, Esther was taken. Let me go back here so that way I can see if anybody comes in. Let's see. Esther was taken to the palace and placed under Haggai, who was in charge of the harem. She won Haggai's favor, who quickly provided her beauty treatments and special food. Meanwhile, Mordecai paced in front of the court of the harem to find out about Esther's welfare. Esther finds favor with the king in verses 12 to 18. After 12 months of beauty treatments, each young woman went to the king. When Esther's turn came, she only asked for what Haggai suggested and found favor in everyone's sight. Esther was chosen by King Xerxes as his queen, and he threw a grand feast, the Feast of Esther, to celebrate this event. During this time, in verses 19 to 23, Mordecai uncovered a conspiracy against the king by two of his officials, Bigthan and Teresh. The plot was reported to the king by Esther, and the culprits were executed. The event was recorded in the presence of the king in the annals. Esther 2 unveils the beginning of a beautiful but complex narrative. King Xerxes, seeking a new queen after dethroning Vashti, initiates a royal decree to gather beautiful young virgins from the kingdom for preparation to be presented to the king. Amidst the chosen is a young Jewish woman named Esther, whose life takes a dramatic turn as she moves from obscurity to the palace. The chapter depicts God's providence, even in seemingly dire circumstances. The rise of Esther, the orphan Jewish girl who becomes the queen of Persia. The themes are divine providence, destiny and purpose, beauty and favor, authority and power, faith and courage, and royal procedures and cultural practices. The topics are the search for a new queen, Esther's life and preparation, Esther's favor with Haggai, Esther's elevation to queen, and Mordecai's discovery of a plot. The people in Esther 2 are King Xerxes, Esther, known as Hadassah, Mordecai, Haggai, Bigthan, and Teresh. The locations are the palace of King Xerxes in Susa and the harem. Okay, the link for this is in the comments section. Oh, and I forgot to do the Esther Chapter 2 cross-references. Okay, there we go. All right. So, say hi, whoever just joined. I see the eye and one person watching. So, all right. So let's go. I'm going to read the NIV version all the way through, and then we're going to break down some of the verses, and then I'm going to read what I found on the name of Esther. Okay? All right. So this is the NIV version. Okay? I'm actually going to read it on the computer through Bible Gateway. Perfect. Later, when King Xerxes Later, when King Xerxes' fury had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what he had decreed about her. Then the king's personal attendants proposed, Let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. Verse 3. Let the king appoint commissioners in every province of his realm to bring all these beautiful young women into the harem at the citadel of Susa. Let them be placed under the care of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women, and let beauty treatments be given to them. Then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This advice appealed to the king, and he followed it. Verse 5. Now there was in the citadel of Susa a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai, son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. Among those taken captive with Jehoiachin, king of Judah, Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he had brought up, because she had neither father nor mother. This young woman, who was also known as Esther, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother died. When the king's order and edict had been proclaimed, many young women were brought to the citadel of Susa and put under the care of Haggai. Esther also was taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Haggai, who had charge of the harem. She pleased him and won his favor. Immediately he provided her with her beauty treatments and special food. He assigned her to 7 female attendants selected from the king's palace and moved her and her attendants into the best place in the harem. Esther had not revealed her nationality and family background because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. Every day he walked back and forth near the courtyard of the harem to find out how Esther was and what was happening to her. Before a young woman's turn came to go into King Xerxes, she had to complete 12 months of beauty treatments prescribed for the women, 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 with perfumes and cosmetics. And this is how, hi Michael and Yuli. And this is how she would go to the king. Anything she wanted was given her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening, she would go there, and in the morning return to another part of the harem to the care of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She would not return to the king unless he was pleased with her and summoned by her name. When the turn came for Esther, the young woman Mordecai had adopted, the daughter of his uncle Abiel, to go to the king, she asked for nothing other than what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the harem, suggested. And Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. She was taken to King Xerxes in the royal residence in the 10th month, the month of Tebet, in the 7th year of his reign. Verse 17. Now the king was attracted to Esther more than any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And the king gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all his nobles and officials. He proclaimed a holiday throughout the provinces and distributed gifts with royal liberality. Verse 19. When the virgins were assembled a second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. But Esther had kept secret her family background and nationality, just as Mordecai had told her to do. for she continued to follow Mordecai's instructions, as she had done when he was bringing her up. Hey, Tanya. Verse 21. During the time Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. But Mordecai found out about the plot and told Queen Esther. Verse 23. Nope. And who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. Verse 23. And when the report was investigated and found to be true, the two officials were impaled on poles. All this was recorded in the book of the Annals, in the presence of the king. Are you able to come on, Tanya, and read? Oh, I don't see her on here. Yuli, are you able to come on? If you can't, that's okay. I'm still going to send the invite. If you could watch, that's okay too. All right. So we read through the NIV version. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and read through some of the background. Okay. So when we go up to verse 2, where it says, "Let a search be made." This method of procuring a queen is unprecedented. If you are able to come on, just make sure that you mute until you're able to talk, so there's no feedback. Queen is unprecedented in the ancient world. Usually the queen was of noble rank, chosen for family or political connections, not simply for her beauty. But that does not rule out the possibility that a beautiful woman might catch the king's eye and rise to a position of power, as in the case of Bathsheba, wife of King David, in 2 Samuel chapter 11. When it refers to virgins, the word here does not necessarily mean those who have never had sexual intercourse, but only young women of marriageable age, still under the authority of their fathers. Nonetheless, in the ancient Near East, it would have been unlikely that the king would have taken married or sexually active women into his harem. While there were cases when a king might take another man's wife, such cases were, hey Alice, such cases were usually politically motivated, as when David took Michal, daughter of the former King Saul, from her current husband in order to solidify his association with the royal house. And we see that in 2 Samuel chapter 3, verses 13 to 15. Or were regarded as examples of tyranny, as with David and Bathsheba in 2 Samuel. You don't have a shirt on, you need to go, please. One moment, you guys. All right. Sorry about that, guys. Okay. So, or were regarded, okay, so where we see David and Bathsheba in 2 Samuel chapter 11. There is no reason to assume that married women were taken into Xerxes' harem. Now, the harem is where the wives and the concubines were housed. And so in verse 3, it says, in every province of his realm. So remember in chapter 1, it says that the provinces in his realm were a total of 127, from India to Kush, I believe it was. Okay, and he had the decree declared in every one of the languages that were there in the harem. Or not in the harem, in the 127 provinces. So in verse 3, it's the text that clearly indicates that the candidates for queen were to be taken from all the different ethnic groups in Xerxes' kingdom. While it would not have been unusual for the king's harem to include women of various nationalities, it may have been exceptional for the queen to be a non-Persian. But there were documented exceptions to the tradition, including Artaxerxes I, which is his son, and Darius II, both of whom had Babylonian queens. When we refer to harem, it's literally the house of women, a special quarters reserved for the king's wives and concubines. In verse 5, where it talks about the tribe of Benjamin, the son of Shammai, the son of Kish, and this is in reference to Mordecai. Okay, the reference to a Benjamite named Kish is reminiscent of Saul, the first king of Israel. Saul was also of Benjamin, and his father was named Kish. We see that in 1 Samuel chapter 9, verse 1. The name Shammai, too, is associated with the house of Saul. We see that in 2 Samuel chapter 16, verse 5. Mordecai's forebears named here are probably not the same people mentioned in the books of Samuel, but it is not impossible since the word son in Hebrew can simply mean descendant. The allusion to Saul, however, is probably deliberate, given Mordecai's antagonism to Haman, who is identified as an Agagite, the known opponent of Saul, and we see that in chapter 3, verse 1 of Esther, the note. We'll get to that tomorrow, but it talks about Haman. So when we get to the most controversial verse, maybe not so, but it has been in the last few days. Verse 7, Hadassah. Okay. Like Mordecai, Esther had a Babylonian name, but her Hebrew name is also recorded. The Hebrew name Hadassah evidently means myrtle. This name is not attested anywhere else in the Old Testament or in any known ancient records or literature. The Babylonian name Esther derives from Ishtar, the name of one of the most widely honored pagan goddesses. Since Ishtar was the goddess of love, the name seems especially fitting for the woman who has destined to win the heart of the Persian king. Now I'm going to pause there, okay, because I'm going to go up and do the cross references for verse 6, which talks about the Babylonian. Actually, let me go ahead and reread it. Verse 6 says, who had been carried away into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, among those taken captive with Jehoiachin, king of Judah. Okay, so we're going to pause there and we're going to go to the cross references. The cross reference for verse 6, I'm going to repost it and we're going to read it. Okay, so that way we can get a background before we go to verse 7, and then we talk about the name Esther, and then we'll move forward. Okay, so hopefully you'll see the verses in there. It's 2 Kings chapter 24, verse 6, and verse 15. So we're going to go there. So it mentions Jehoiachin, okay? So in 2 Kings chapter 24, verse 6 and 15, it says, Jehoiakim slept with his fathers, which means in death, and his son Jehoiachin became king in his palace. Verse 15 says, Nebuchadnezzar led Jehoiachin away into exile to Babylon. Also, he took the king's mother and the king's wives and his officials and the leading men of the land, including Ezekiel, as exiles from Jerusalem to Babylon. Okay? Now, when we go to Second Chronicles talks about the kings. Okay? So Second Chronicles chapter 36, verses 9 through 10 says Jehoiachin was 18 years old when he became king, and he reigned for 3 months and 10 days in Jerusalem. and he did evil in the sight of the Lord. Verse 10. Now at the turn of the year in the spring, King Nebuchadnezzar sent word and had him brought to Babylon with the valuable articles of the house of the Lord, and made his brother Zedekiah king over Judah and Jerusalem. Okay? When we go down to verse 20, it says, he deported to Babylon those who had escaped from the sword, and they were servants to him and to his sons until the kingdom of Persia was established there. Okay? Now, we start to see a little bit more of the picture of what verse 6 in Esther is talking about, right? In chapter 2. So then we go to Daniel, and Daniel digs a little bit more. It says, it's Daniel 1, verses 1 through 5. In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, remember that's Jehoiakim's father, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles of the house of God. And he brought them into the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, lowercase g, and brought the articles into the treasury of his God. And the Babylonian king told Ashpenaz, the chief of his officials, to bring in some of the sons of Israel, including some from the royal family and from the nobles. Verse 4, young men without blemish and handsome in appearance, skillful in all wisdom, and endowed with intelligence and discernment, and quick to understand, competent to stand in the presence of the king, and able to serve in the king's palace. He also ordered one moment. Sorry, guys. Okay, verse 4. Nope, I'm down to 5. Still finishing 4. Okay, and able to serve in the king's palace. He also ordered Ashpenaz to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. And here the note is, the Chaldeans dominated and ruled Babylonia from 625 BC until the empire fell in 539 BC. But they were known as early as 1000 BC as an aggressive tribal people in the southern region of Babylonia. They were highly skilled with both the science of astronomy and the pseudoscience of astrology. They kept meticulous records of celestial motion and correctly calculated the length of year to within just a few minutes. Babylon, their capital city, was the center of trade and learning in the western part of Asia. The classical literature of the Chaldeans was written in cuneiform, but the common language, both written and spoken in Babylon, was Akkadian, increasingly influenced by Aramaic. Okay? 5. The king assigned a daily ration for them from his finest food and from wine, which he drank. They were to be educated and nourished this way for 3 years, so that at the end of that time, they were prepared to enter the king's service. Okay? So again, these were people that were taken. These were people from Israel, okay, sons of Israel that were taken in Babylon captivity, and they were being trained. They had to have certain requirements in order to be trained for these 3 years in the culture of the Chaldeans. Okay. So when we go down to Daniel chapter 5, verse 13, which is the last cross reference for Esther chapter 2, verse 6, it says, it talks about Daniel interprets the handwriting on the wall. it's verse 13 says, Then Daniel was brought in before the king, and the king said to Daniel, Are you the Daniel who is one of the sons of the exiles of Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah? Okay, so now we can kind of see a bigger picture of what chapter 2 verse 6 is referring to when it talks about the captivity of Babylon, right? And where Mordecai came from, where it talks about who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, among those who were taken captive with Jehoiachin, king of Judah. So now we have an understanding of what was going on, what happened, how they got there, who was king, and so on. Okay? So now when we get down to verse 7, where we talk about Hadassah, right? So verse 7, it says, Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother. This young woman, who was also known as Esther, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother died. Okay, so Gino reached out to me. Thank you, Gino. And I read his little note thing that he sent me so gracefully. And so I read it and I was like, okay, Lord, like if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. Like let's do some research. I'm really good with researching. It's like my favorite thing to do. So I did. I read what he sent me and I also, did some research. So there is a little bit of mixture as far as Ishtar and Star. So we're just going to go through it, okay? So the the BibleStudyTools.com, which I put in the chat, says when it refers to Esther, the queen of Ashtoreth, the heroine of the Bible that bears her name, she was a Jewess named Hadassah, which means the myrtle. But when she entered the royal harem, she received the name by which she henceforth became known, which is stated in Esther 2:7. It is a Syro-Arabian modification of the Persian word Satara, which means a star. She was the daughter of Abihail, a Benjamite. Her family did not avail themselves of the permission granted by Cyrus to the exiles to return to Jerusalem. And she resided with her cousin Mordecai, who held some office in the household of the Persian king at Shushan in the palace. You can read more on that, okay? Then the next one is from Jerusalem Prayer Team. The link is also in there. It's under the word of the day. It has it in Hebrew, her name, and the transliteration, which is Esther. Ester. Okay? So it says the important names in the Bible were not given in random order. As the story concerning each character unfolds, we learn how it is connected to the narrative, provided that we focus on the Hebrew name. English, Spanish, Greek, and Latin, along with all other world languages, fall short in demonstrating how, one, the biblical name foreshadows the life events of each personality. Two, the Hebrew name both mirrors and substantiates the truthfulness of biblical events and prophecies. Although reading the Bible in English is also perceived by believers as reading truth, the immediate sense of substantiation, as reflected in the mere Hebrew name, is missing from the non-Hebrew reading experience. This is just one reason why it is important for every Bible follower to obtain some knowledge of Hebrew. Although the name Esther is entwined in Jewish tradition with glory and bravery, the origin of this name is much less pleasant. Hey, Terry. Esther is a derivative of the name Ishtar, the Assyrian and Babylonian goddess of fertility, love, war, and sex. The biblical heroic Esther was called Hadassah, but the king Ahasuerus changes her name to a goddess name to better suit her nobility. King Ahasuerus has done the same to Esther's uncle Mordecai. He was named after the god Marduk or Merodach, as it is mentioned in the Bible in Jeremiah 50:20. The pagan origin of both names was forgotten throughout the generations, and today Esther and also Mordecai have become common Hebrew names. The Women's Zionist Organization of America, Hadassah, was founded during the Purim Jewish holiday of 1912 after Esther the Queen, but after her given Hebrew name, Hadassah, which is myrtle in Hebrew. The name Esther in the Bible, and he brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother, and the maid was beautiful and of good presence. And when her father and her mother died, Mordecai adopted her as a daughter. That's in Esther 2:7. So this resource is from the Jerusalem Prayer Team Hebrew Word of the Day. It is in the chat as something that you can read, go over again. And then the third resource that I found is titled Hello, My Name is Esther. It's written by Robert R. Cargill. He has a PhD, Bible and Archaeology, University of Iowa. And so when you click on his name, you can get a little bit more of his background. He is a scholar of Jewish and biblical studies, archaeologist, author, and digital humanist. His research interests include Second Temple Judaism, literary criticism of the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament and New Testament, the Qumran and the Dead Sea Scrolls, Swadegrapha, and Apocrypha, and the archaeology of Southwest Asia. Okay, and then he has a whole background. So when I go back to what he wrote, he says, the name Esther has a long and fascinating history. The name seems to be etymologically related to the stars, beginning all the way back with the Babylonians, Akkadians, and Assyrians, who worshipped a female deity named Ishtar. Ishtar was previously worshipped by earlier Mesopotamians as Inanna, Inanna, goddess of love, beauty, sex, war, justice, and political power. She was associated with the planet Venus and was known as the Queen of Heaven. It's mentioned in Jeremiah chapter 7, verse 18, chapter 44, verse 17 to 19, and chapter 25. The Old Persian language preserves the word stara for star, which is similar to the Greek word aster, also meaning star. Thus, Esther likely means star, if not something related more directly to Ishtar or Venus. However, because the biblical book of Esther was written during the Greek period and set during the Persian period, Esther 2:7 says that Esther's actual name was Hadassah, but that she took a Persian name, Esther, in order to conceal her Jewish identity. Coincidentally, the Hebrew root str means to conceal, but this appears to be a highly selective etymology, especially given the choice of the Hebrew letter Sameka instead of sin, S-I-N. It has like the thing at the top for the S, devised to disguise the fact that hers was a common Persian name, either the word for star or the name of the deity Ishtar. So again, mixed reviews, right? The final resource, all these resources that I'm reading off is in the chat. You can look at it on your own. I'll also apply it in the YouTube version of this in case you have to, stop, go back, watch it, slow it down, speed it up, whatever you need to do. You'll have that. Hey, Wendy. And God bless you too. So the last resource of the name Esther, okay, it is from the Abarim Publications. Has the biblical Hebrew written out, has the meaning star, comma, myrtle, the etymology from a Greco-Persian word for star or the Median word for myrtle. And then when it goes down to, when you scroll down just a little bit, it'll give you the name Esther in the Bible. It'll go over that. It'll go over the etymology and the meaning of the name Esther, which says the name Esther obviously stems from the same Indo-European root that gives us our English word star and the Greek equivalent Esther. And then it gives the Biblical Dictionary, Abram's publication version of it in yellow. And when we scroll down a little bit, it says more specifically, actually, let me go back up a little bit. It says the name Esther obviously stems from, I read that, stems from the Proto-Indo-European root that gave us our English word star and the Greek equivalent Esther. More specifically, the name Esther probably stems from the Persian expression of this very old PIE root meaning star, namely Satera, which is conveniently similar to the Median word Astra, meaning myrtle, which is a plant with tiny flowers like stars in the night sky. The name Esther was probably given to Hadassah when she entered the court of the Persian king. Compare it to Daniel and his friends. And as such, she was known by the people. Note that the name Esther is closely related to the name Ishtar, or Ashtoreth in Hebrew, which belonged to Babylon's primary female deity. The name of Esther, uncle Mordecai, is closely akin to Marduk, the patron god of the city of Babylon. The story of Esther obviously has a double bottom. It suggests that the Hebrews figured that the Babylonian One second. Sorry, guys. Sorry, guys. All right. Where was I? Okay. The story of Esther obviously has a double bottom. It suggests that the Hebrews figured that the Babylonian reality model greatly favored the worldview of the Jews. In the book of Esther, the Babylonian gods, or rather the people who served them, forced their Babylonian subjects to accept and appreciate Hebrew theology and weed out the elements who aggress it. But to a Hebrew audience, the name Esther, the way it was written, had far more meaning than simply the word star in the language of their abductors. So it goes more into it. I won't go more into it. You can go ahead and do that. The resources are available to you. I want to encourage you to look at it more. I don't think any of us are wrong. I think that it is what it is. The Babylonians looked at the name one way, the Hebrews looked at it another way. Jewish tradition looks at it another way. But whatever your convictions are, right? So thank you, Gino, for bringing me that resource. Thank you all for this conversation on the name of Esther. I think it brought some colorfulness to all of this. So let's get to the cultural background for verse 8. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and read it. Just because we went through all of those resources, I want to reconnect us back to the text. Okay. So if you go to Esther chapter 2, verse 8, it says, when the king's order and edict had been proclaimed, many young women were brought to the citadel of Susa and put under the care of Haggai. Esther also was taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Haggai, who had charge of the harem. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the cultural background as stated in this Bible. I'm not making any of this up. I'm going strictly off of what it says here, okay? All right. So when it refers to taken to the king's palace, although only one woman would be chosen to replace Vashti, the other women would not be able to return to their homes. Rather, they would all become wives of the king, even only of concubine. So that would be their status. See note on 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 3. I'm going to go ahead and go there real quick. 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 3. Fingers are sticking. So the note for that, it says, chapter 11, verse 3. Okay, concubines. In addition to being a status symbol, the royal harem maintained close ties to Solomon's constitutes through marriage into families of varying clans, tribes, and social classes, including wives of higher status who counted among the royalty. Counting royal women by the hundreds was not unusual during the Iron Age. Assyrian wine lists from Nimrod indicate that as many as 300 women of various ranks lived at the palace. That's crazy. That's too much. So, all right. Now, when we go back to the cultural background for verse 8 in Esther, okay, chapter 2, it says, they remained in the harem even after one was selected to be queen. So Esther did not commit fornication when she finally slept with the king, as some commentators have suggested. Rather, she was fulfilling her conjugal duties as one of the king's wives. In verse 9, where it talks about special food, now my limited understanding is that the Jewish people, obviously, they would have certain things that they could eat and certain things that they did not eat based off of what was considered clean and unclean according to the laws of Moses, right? And I believe we see that in Leviticus, I believe is where we see it. So clearly, with Esther needing to be hidden her own background and where she came from, right? She obviously couldn't adjust her eating habits to continue the way that her heritage would only eat, right? So it's going to talk a little bit about that. So when it refers to the special food in verse 9, it's literally referring to her portion of food. The Hebrew word translated portion generally means something reserved for those in special positions and offices, such as kings or Levites. We see this in 2 Chronicles chapter 31, verse 3, Nehemiah chapter 12, verse 44. And the text does not necessarily imply that Esther's food was different from that of the other concubines, but apparently the chief eunuch attended to her food personally. Unlike Daniel and his companions in Daniel 1, Esther seems to have had no qualms about accepting food from the royal household. Indeed, the fact that she had not revealed her nationality, which is mentioned in verse 10, implies that she ate the same food as the rest of the women in the harem, since demanding a kosher diet would have betrayed her nationality. See, these are the same things that I'll speak for myself, that I didn't think of when initially reading through Esther. Like, oh yeah, like how did she hide her background so well and still stay true to her culture? well, she followed whatever her uncle told her to do, and had she not been obedient to his instructions, who knows what would have happened, right? Yes, please elaborate. Did I elaborate on the specific thing that you were referring to, Wendy? So in verse 11, where it says he walked near the courtyard of the harem, this is referring to Mordecai. Okay, the Greek author Plutarch, among others, reports that the Persian nobles were jealous of their harems, and any man who approached them would be killed. But Herodotus writes of eunuchs admitting men to the harems, and one noble man spoke regularly with his daughter, who was one of the royal wives. It was probably not difficult for Mordecai to see his cousin and even this refers to his cousin, uncle. Okay. And even speak to her, so long as he had the permission of the chief eunuch. I was referring to the foods we should and shouldn't eat, but I think that's for another class. Yeah, because I have not. See, that's another thing too. It's like this is all part of the unlearning and relearning part, right? And really digging into our Bibles and having the understanding. Okay, is this descriptive or prescriptive? Is this for today or was it for a time? Was it for a people? Was it, how do we check all those things off? But yeah, that's definitely for another class. One that I need to look into too. Okay. That would be fun to kind of like look into though. Okay. Um, verse 3 or 13. Okay. Verse 13, when we go up to verse 13, okay, according to Greek sources, the royal concubines were expected to entertain the king in various ways throughout the night, ready to provide sexual companionship when requested. We can assume that the women were given items that would help them with their diversions, including musical instruments, harps, and flutes, musicians to accompany their singing, and perhaps other tools of entertainment. Verse 14, where it refers to the concubines, that's where I went back and I read 1 Kings 11:13, that little side note, so you can just kind of rewind a little bit. I go back, you can hear me read that part. But verse 15, where it talks about the eunuchs in charge of the harem. So if we want to go back and read up, it says, when the turn came for Esther, the young woman Mordecai had adopted, the daughter of his uncle, Abiel, to go to the king, she asked for nothing other than what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the harem, suggested. Okay, so it's in reference to that. Okay. We know much about the administration of ancient harems from records found primarily in Assyria. These documents demonstrate that harem life was well regulated and under watchful eye and of trusted eunuchs. There were frequent conflicts among the women, as they would sometimes scheme and plot for favors for themselves and any children they had borne. The eunuchs were charged to ensure that such conflicts did not erupt in violence. I can only imagine. So, my time, in my past life, okay, and I'm not talking about a spiritual past life, okay, before Christ, BC, we had a room, and all the dancers would go back into the room, and we would have to share this little space, or we would have to get ready, where we would do our drinking or drugging or whatever it was that we were doing. We'd have this small little bathroom, depending on the size of the club that you worked at. and it would get really packed back there. And sometimes there would be fights. And of course, there were times when like there were certain cliques and then there were certain girls who were outcasted and stuff like that. So I can only imagine being in this palace with 300 other women. We could barely handle the 20 girls that would hang out in the back on the slow night. Like that was crazy. That'd be crazy for me. That's crazy. But yeah, okay, move on. Chapter or verse 18, where it talks about he proclaimed a holiday. This is literally he caused a rest to take place. This phrase is ambiguous and has been interpreted as a release from work, from military service, or from taxation. In verse 21, and then we have 23 after that, and then that's it for the cultural background. And then we'll go back and recap everything that we have discussed, and we'll read the amplified version to tie everything all together, and then we'll end on that. All right? So, in verse 21, where it refers to officers, this was literally the eunuchs, okay? This story is reminiscent of an incident in which a eunuch assassinated Artaxerxes the third in order to replace him with Artaxerxes' son Arsus. That's a lot of Arsus. Okay, so King Xerxes had a child whose name was Artaxerxes. You know what I'm talking about. And then obviously they had a concession of that. 2, 3, and then 3 had a son named Arsus, right? And so when we go up to 21, it's referring to the plot that Mordecai found out about. Okay. So verse 21, it says, during the time Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bithana and Teresh, 2 of the king's officers, eunuchs, who guarded the doorway, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. Okay, so that's what this is referring to. Okay. Verse 23 is the background of it is very interesting. It talks about these 2 eunuchs or officers being impaled. Okay. And keep this in mind too, because this happens to Haman, all right? When he plans to have his devious plan to kill Mordecai and the Jewish people, well, it backfires. And so the same thing that's listed here about these 2 officers being impaled also happens to Haman later on, okay? So when it talks about impaled on poles, the Hebrew word translated poles literally means tree or wooden object. The text refers to the common practice of impaling victims on wooden stakes. The Code of Hammurabi and Assyrian law codes sometimes prescribe impaling as an actual method of execution. And the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal II bragged of how he impaled rebellious vassals. But more often, malefactors were executed by other methods, and their dead bodies were impaled for a public display. Also, it has been demonstrated that the Persians practiced crucifixion, and the punishment spoken of here might refer to that practice, impaling people alive on wooden posts and allowing them to die of exposure. When it refers to the Book of Annals, because this is where it was written, and this, when it talks about the Book of Annals, let me go back up because it mentions, it says in verse 23, it says, all this was recorded in the book of the Annals in the presence of the king. Okay, so everything that was done to these eunuchs and the reason why, okay, was written in this in the book of the Annals. The king later, King Xerxes later, is also going to refer back to this book, okay, and it plays a very important role in a turn of events. Okay, the king has a hard time sleeping, and so he asks one of his officers or one of his officials to come and read him that book, and he finds out what Mordecai did, and a change of events happens along with a chain of events. Okay, so when it refers to that, all the ancient Near Eastern monarchs kept records of events that occurred during their reign. Okay, and we also see kind of like an example, I guess, of it in Second Chronicles when it talks about like all the kings, and it says, and it was written in this book, and it was written in this on this scroll, and it was written on this, and so I imagine that's kind of the same thing. So now that we've talked about the background and certain key words and phrases, we've talked about the name Esther, let's go ahead and refer to the Amplified Version. The reason why I like the Amplified Version is it gives us more context about words and phrases that are used, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it even uses the original name. So like for Xerxes, it uses King Ahasuerus. Okay, so here we go. This is the end of it. Okay, Esther chapter 2 verse 1. After these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus, Xerxes, had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's attendants who served him said, let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king. Let the king appoint administrators in all the provinces of his kingdom, and have them gather all the beautiful young virgins to the citadel in Susa, into the harem, under the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women, and let their beauty preparations be given to them. Remember, this was a year. 6 months of this, 6 months of that, a year of preparation. And this was, if you go back to 1, this is during he leaves. And so all this is going to be going on when he leaves. Okay, the king. Then the young woman who pleases the king be queen in place of Vashti. This pleased the king, and he did accordingly. There was a certain Jew in the citadel of Susa, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been deported from Jerusalem with the captives who had been in exile with Jeconiah. That's the Hebrew version of, I think it's Jeconiah. I think it's the same pronunciation, I believe. Who was 18 years old when he became king after his father was killed. There we go. Okay. Who had been deported from Jerusalem with the captives who had been exiled with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had exiled. Now we also have a background of what was occurring during that time as well. Okay. He was the guardian of Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had no father or mother. The young woman was beautiful of form and face, and her father and mother died. And when her father and mother died, Mordecai took her in as his own daughter. So it became, verse 8, so it came about when the king's command and his decree were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered together in the citadel of Susa into the custody of Haggai, that Esther was taken to the king's palace and placed in the custody of Haggai, who was in charge of the women. Now the young woman pleased Haggai and found favor with him. So he quickly provided her with beauty preparations and her portion of food. And he gave her 7 choice maids from the king's palace. Then he transferred her and her maids to the best place in the harem. Esther did not reveal the Jewish background of her people or her family, for Mordecai had instructed her not to do so. Every day Mordecai, who was an attendant in the king's court, walked back and forth in front of the courtyard of the harem to learn how Esther was getting along and what was happening to her. Verse 12. Now when it was each young woman's turn to go before King Ahasuerus, after the end of her 12 months under the regulations for the woman, for the days of their beautification were completed as follows: 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with sweet spices and perfumes, and the beauty preparations for women. Then the young woman would go before the king in this way. Anything that she wanted was given her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. 14. In the evening she would go in, and the next morning she would return to the second harem, to the custody of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She would not return to the king unless he delighted in her and she was summoned by name. Now, as for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai. Okay, that's where the whole cousin thing fits in. Oh, sorry, Mom. Okay. Who had taken her in as his own daughter. When her turn came to go into the king, she requested nothing except what Haggai, the king's eunuch and attendant, who was in charge of the women, advised. And Esther found favor in the sight of all who saw her. So Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus, to his royal palace in the 10th month. That is the month of Tebet, which is between December and January. It has it in the parentheses. In the 7th year of his reign. Verse 17. Now the king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she found favor and kindness with him more than all the other virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen in the place of Vashti. Then the king held a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all his officials and his servants. And he made a festival for the provinces and gave gifts in accordance with the resources of the king. When the virgins were gathered together the second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Esther had not revealed her family or her people, that is, her Jewish background, just as Mordecai had instructed her. For Esther did what Mordecai told her, just as when she was under his care. In those days, while Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, 2 of the king's eunuchs who guarded the door, became angry and conspired to attack King Ahasuerus. But the plot became known to Mordecai, who informed Queen Esther, and Esther told the king in Mordecai's name. Now when the plot was investigated and found to be true, both men were hanged on the gallows, and it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the king's presence. And the Amplified version and the NIV version in the Bible Gateway that I put in the comment section has footnotes. So you can go back and you can read what those footnotes are to get an even bigger picture. Again, I put the cross references for the verses of chapter 2 in there as well. So if you want to go back and look at those as well, you can do that. You'll also see this video. I put the link to the playlist for both Job and Esther at the very top of the comment section. So in your own time, you can go back from the beginning, you can pause and take a break, you can do all the things that you need to do while still being able to follow along with where we are at in Esther. I hope that was fun. It was for me. Um, so yeah, so thank you guys for joining me for Esther 2. I'm excited for Esther 3. Again, the Bible I'm using, it's the Cultural Backgrounds Study Bible. That's where I'm getting, most of the resources from. Of course, when questions are asked, like the whole debate on Esther's name, I'll go online and I'll do research on it, and then I'll bring it forward. And then whatever your convictions are is whatever your convictions are, right? So we're all learning. We're all at different phases of this. And so I just want to thank you all for those who are choosing to be on this journey with me. And I hope that we can make it to the end of Esther. But I love you all. God bless you. You're welcome, Wendy. No, that's okay. That's okay that you couldn't comment too much. I'm glad that you were able to listen and join. So I love you all, and I will see you tomorrow at 1 p.m. Arizona time, and that is 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. All right. Bye, guys.